Hello, hello. Just you and
Let me
Todd
get
today?
let me get my video going here. For some reason it's not. There we go.
Okay, perfect. Oh, there you go.
There's Todd. As he slowly moves in from, okay, you're muted.
There you go. Everybody's there.
Christy. Da, 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 da.
Christy, you need to unmute and start your video.
She's trying. There she goes.
There she is.
All right.
Yay, we're all
Welcome
here.
to
Yeah.
Contact Talk Radio.
Welcome.
Well,
How much time we got, Kim?
You have about 2 minutes to go, so stand by.
2 minutes. Christy, I saw you doing some live TV shows. Do you still do quite a bit of those, or?
Yeah, they're hard to get, the national shows. So I did one a couple weeks ago.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's fun.
Nice. Yeah. Well, how long has your book been out?
September 10th.
Oh, wow.
About a month.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's
Nice.
Yeah, it just came out.
Oh, cool.
But you have a couple of more books too, right?
Yes, I have a book called What I Wish I'd Known, and that's my story of my husband and his depression, and then Tools for Grief. And then Are You Okay, which was a precursor to this. So Beneath the Surface is kind of taking the place of Are You Okay?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Are they all targeted for youth or just for anyone?
What I Wish I'd Known is for anybody grieving a loss of any kind. So it's Tools for Grief. So that's not so much about warning signs and risk factors. It's just how to get through what you're going through.
All right, stand by. Here we go.
Here we go.
You can also leave a suggestion. Then, when you're done, rate the show. The hosts love your feedback, and others appreciate it. So next time you download a show, take a second to leave your thoughts and rate it.
The views expressed on contacttalkradio.com are those of the guest hosts and callers, and not necessarily of this station, its management, or other advertisers.
This is contacttalkradio.com. Consciousness in action. And you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Bing.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Welcome to Life Mastery with Todd Allen, the talk radio show that dives into the science of higher consciousness. Join Todd and his guests weekly at 10 a.m. Pacific Time and learn how to live a peaceful life with intentional mastery. Enjoy a survey of inspiring topics such as abundance, intention, health, manifestation, love, and transformation. It's all right here. Leading authors, speakers, coaches, entrepreneurs with stories and messages to support your well-being, let alone your most evocative dreams.
Hey, it's another groovy day, and most of you that listen on a regular basis know that's because when I woke up this morning, I decided it was going to be that way, and it is totally a groovy day. More than that, it's Life Mastery Radio Day. Yay! I just love every Tuesday at 10 a.m. I get to connect with cool people on the cutting edge of what's going on in the world to help make a difference in other people's very own life mastery journey. Before I get started, though, like always, I kind of like to get myself, I like to get myself centered and situated and just get ready for the show and maybe just roll those shoulders a little bit. Maybe a big stretch to reach way up high toward the universe or toward whatever it is that you believe in that gives you power. Just kind of roll those shoulders a little bit, and let's take in a deep breath. And let that breath out with a big ah. And just let your essence and who you are just flow up from your solar plexus through your heart center, up through your speaker box, and right out that speaker box mouth of yours and the universe. And we're going to, I hear some giggling in the back. That's cool, though, because that means I'm giggling. Let's do that one more time. Dreams, visions, and goals just flow right up through those same places and out into the universe. And here's the most important part, is allow the universe the opportunity to make those come true for you. Mm-hmm. As always, you can hear she's probably the one that was giggling. My co-host is with me today, Jackie Bailey. And Jackie, look at that cool sign right behind her.
Woo! Broadcasting live from the Speaking Studio.
From the Speaking Studio.
That's right.
Jackie does some amazing things with young people in teaching them to find their voice and to develop that voice and really explore it. And I don't think there's anything else that young people are exposed to help them with that. They would certainly don't get it in school. So Jackie, clue us in a little bit. You've been doing this now probably a little over a month. I mean, you've been doing it for a very long time, but this is your own gig. I mean, this is
it's my own place.
Jackie Bailey stuff.
A while, yeah. So I've been doing this for about 4 or 5 years, but before a month ago, I was traveling to do a class here and traveling to do a class there, and now I have my own place and people come to me. And so that's really the big change. But my curriculum's pretty much the same, and I'm excited to talk with our guests today because we both have this desire to help our youth. You know, they've got so many things in life to deal with that we didn't. And social media has just impacted for good and bad so many lives. And my workshops started out being titled "Communicate with More Than Thumbs," because these kids were just on their devices, you know, and they didn't know.
I didn't know that part.
A real life conversation with each other. It was just all about texting, right? And that's not good for our soul. We need to connect with other people, and I think that Christy will probably tell us the same thing, that we need to really connect.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it, is the disconnect, and we'll talk more with our guest today. I want to remind the listeners that today's show page is at www.lifemasteryradio.net. You can go there and find the links to our guests and anything else that we talk about. Jackie Bailey's website is right there. Look at that. That's cool.
Follow the bouncing finger.
And if you're interested, you're doing some online classes now too, right?
Yeah. In fact, I would like to do some online courses in the Caribbean to prepare for going there this summer and doing some camps. So if anybody out there listening lives in the U.S. Virgin Islands or somewhere in the Caribbean, I'm welcome to do some online classes to prepare for some summer camps this spring or summer, depending upon the school system and how that works in those different places, and come there for a couple of weeks and give some classes to kids. So, yeah.
Put it out there, Jackie.
Let me know. Contact me on my website. Let me know where you live. And if you got a little room
our guest today is down in Southern California, and I hear it's 90 degrees. Would that be a good start? If you're from San Diego, or you?
Well, no, my husband is. My husband is from San Diego. Yeah.
Right. So
I think that it would be fun to live there, but it's just so expensive now that I don't know that we ever really could. And most of our families now moved away from there, so we don't really have too many reasons to go back and visit. But yeah. Well, but I'd like to go visit Christy.
Look at that great smiling face. Well, we're just going to jump right into the show. Although, if you go to lifemasteryradio.net or .com, sign up for our newsletter. Jackie does a great job every week of highlighting the guests that have been on the show and who's coming up on the show. And she also has she has a blog post, a very cool blog post, about the show and highlights what we talked about. So it's kind of cool.
And you can also find Todd's book. Todd's got a great book that he's
Thanks
written.
for the plug.
Yeah, about just mastering your life. And there's lots of principles he teaches and characteristics you need to have. So go there and check that out as well.
It's a really cool book, and you will just love it. And the only thing that I ask is after you read it and you love it, go to Amazon and leave me some feedback. Yay.
Yay.
Kind of a cool book. And I've really got some great feedback, and it just takes more and more and more and more. Not to stroke the ego at all, but to entice other people that this should be something that they can read. Okay. I think we're done with housekeeping. On with the show. You can see our lovely guest there just shining in some bright light, and her name is Christy Hugstad, and she is the author of the book Beneath the Surface, a teen's guide to reaching out when you or your friend is in crisis and wish I had known, which addresses really her husband's suicide. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Christy is a certified grief recovery specialist and a grief and loss facilitator for recovering addicts at South Coast Behavioral Health. Christy frequently speaks at high schools. She is also the host of the Grief Girl podcast and lives in Orange County, California. And you can find her at www.thegriefgirl.com. And that link is at lifemasteryradio.com or .net. Christy, welcome to the show, my friend. How are you today?
I am doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
You've enticed my co-host in her thinking that nice, warm, sandy beaches.
You are so welcome
That's right.
to come and visit. And
All right.
don't be fooled. I grew up in Minnesota, so I went from one extreme to the other. So I've
There
paid.
you go. Good. And you're finally getting that payoff.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, what we're talking about today, Chris, and I understand you have written many books, but the one book that we're talking about is Beneath the Surface. And before we get too far into that, you have an amazing story that started this all off. And maybe you could give us the version that that really speaks to the heart of what's going on in today's world and how this can all of a sudden manifest and be a real part of our world.
Well, my husband, Bill, completed suicide about 7 years ago. And at that time, he was going through a major depression, a lot of traumatic life changes. There were so many warning signs and risk factors that were right in front of me, and I didn't recognize them. So instead of really relating to him and sitting down and saying things like, Bill, I'm here for you. We're going to work on this together. I was more fixated on trying to get my old husband back. I wanted our lives to be the way that they were, and I wanted a man that I had married back. Right. So I will honestly say, looking back, I also bought into that stigma because I didn't want my husband to be mentally ill. I didn't want him to have major depression. So I was on a mission to try to fix him. And all those warning signs and risk factors, he was withdrawn. He had such a sense of hopelessness. It was hard for him to even get up out of bed and take a shower and go to work for a couple of hours. The constant talk of not wanting to be here. He had 2 grandparents as well that had a suicide attempt. So there was also a genetic component, which is a risk factor. So now when I look back and I see all those warning signs and risk factors, I realize that, my husband was 54 years old and he had already bought into the stigma of mental illness. And as a young boy, I think he grew up thinking that to show emotion or to reach out for help or to say, I feel like crying or whatever that emotion is, I think he was raised that is a sign of weakness. So he never said to me, hey, Christy, I need help.
Right.
Something's not right. And since he had already bought into the stigma, it was too late for Bill. And that was probably 40 years of buying into that stigma. So after his suicide, which he ran in front of a train in Dana Point where we lived, and like I explained earlier, his father was on that train that he ran in front of.
And he knew that.
He knew his father was on the train because he had been corresponding with him all day to pick him up. His father had flown from Houston, Texas, and then boarded a train from San Diego to San Juan Capistrano. And my husband was supposed to pick his father up 20 minutes after his suicide.
Wow.
So, yeah, he knew his father was on that train. So it just, the story is so tragic, but it also lets your listeners know how sick he was, how deep he was into his depression, and what a dark place he was in, because he loved his father and he had a great relationship with him. So when somebody is in that dark of a place, it's not so much that they want to die, they just want to end that emotional pain. And that's where Bill was at. So looking back, I thought, you know what? I have to do something with my pain. I have two choices. I can either be a victim and feel sorry for myself and not get out of bed and fall into a depressive state myself, or I can use my pain to help other people so that nobody else has to go through the pain that I experienced. So when I took a real close look at it, I thought, you know, if we're going to get rid of that stigma of mental illness, it needs to start young. We need to start with our youth so that they grow up in a culture that embraces mental health, just like our physical health. And so that's what inspired me to write Beneath the Surface. And
Right.
that book is for teens, parents, administrators, teachers, to try to get all of us on the same page so that we can all reach out and help each other.
What would that look like? I mean, what would that look like if as a society, we put a focus on mental health just as much as we put on physical health?
You know, for example, if you broke your arm, or if a teenager broke their arm, everybody would rush to sign their cast, right? So that's kind of a cool thing. So when you have a physical ailment, if you were diagnosed with cancer, you wouldn't lie in bed and think, oh, I hope this passes. You know, you would go in for treatment and get help. But the first step in recognizing that you need help is to know the warning signs and risk factors. You can't get help for something you're not aware of.
Right.
So if we're all on the same page and we recognize those warning signs and risk factors, as I did not, then we will be able to reach out and say things like, hey, you know, what you're saying to your son, I noticed you've been really quiet lately, and that's not like you. Is everything okay? Are you okay? Because we can't wait for them to come to a trusted adult to get that help. We need to recognize those warning signs and risk factors as well.
Well, and I think, you know, at some point as a society, we have to bring in awareness, right? I'm sure we're all aware of this, but we're not aware of the what do I want to say, how prevalent it is in our society. I mean, this happens on a daily basis, and, you know, there are things going on in our society that are turbocharging it, like bullying and the disconnect that we have with communication. And people see all over the place, oh, their life is great. They're all rosy and cherry and smiley face, and I feel like I don't belong here. And so there's no identifier there. Am I following along, right, Christy?
Absolutely. And that's the really tragic thing for our youth today, is it's all about, they're the like generation. How many likes are you getting on Snapchat and Instagram? And they compare their lives to the fictitious lives that their peers are putting on social media, and they feel like they're not a part of it and they're not measuring up. So technology is playing a big part in this rising epidemic of teen suicide. And I'll speak for myself, and I'm sure maybe you guys can relate. When I was a teen, at least when I got home from school, I had a safe place, because I didn't have an iPhone. and nobody could cyberbully me at home. So if they wanted to continue to bully me, they had to call a landline, right?
Yeah.
And my parents might answer. So at least I had a safe place after school. And that's not the case with our youth today, because when they get home, that's when the cyberbullying starts. That's when all of their peers have time to reach out and to get on their technology and continue the bullying. And it's a big factor in teen suicide, because if you think about it, school and their peers, that is their world.
Right. That's where they survive.
Right. And if they are being tortured and tormented to the point where they don't want to go to school and they no longer want to exist, they are taking their lives. And it's happening every day. And
now, I don't want to tell a lie, but did I just hear recently that teen suicide rates are high, really high right now?
they're skyrocketing. They're at epidemic proportions.
Yeah.
And it is because, in a large part, to technology and the cyberbullying. About a week ago, there was a 10-year-old girl
Yeah, I
in
saw
my
that.
area that took her life because of
10 years old.
10 years
10
old.
years old.
And then last week, there was an 8-year-old boy. So it's
I missed
starting
that.
even younger than our teens.
Yeah.
Wow.
Christy, before we get too far into that, though, I want to back up just for a second because something came to my mind. You know, this event was, I'm sure, very tragic for you, but I get it, and as it would be. This was a total game changer, right? I mean, now you're writing books. You are considered the grief girl. And what I'm really curious about, what prepared you for all of this, or what did you do before this game-changing event happened?
My husband and I were gym owners,
Oh.
and we had a very successful gym. He was a bodybuilder, a weight trainer. He ran the weight room. I taught the spinning and the Pilates. So we had a successful gym. We had a little vacation home in Rosarito, Mexico, where we'd go on the weekends. So from the outside, it looked like we were living this
Right.
idealistic life. But what people didn't realize is that Bill was suffering from depression. And again, we were not who we appeared to be.
Right.
So I really, to answer your question, I really had no preparation. I became a grief recovery specialist after Bill's death. I started writing my story and journaling as a part of my healing in my grief journey. And then I thought, you know what? I want to write a book about Bill's story. But more importantly, the second half of the book, I want to share with people the tools that I used for my grief recovery,
Right.
so that they're not floundering. And then I gave specific examples of exactly what I did. So that was my first book. That was called What I Wish I'd Known, Finding Your Way Through the Tunnel of Grief. So it started out just my own journaling and for my own healing. And then after some time passed, I thought, now I'm becoming a lot more passionate about abolishing the stigma of mental illness. And then I started doing a little checklist of everything that I had been through, all the warning signs and risk factors that I didn't understand or take seriously. So that prompted me to write Beneath the Surface, because like I said earlier, we have to change the culture and we have to change the conversation and start with our young people.
Yeah. Well, and it's curious to me because you said that you two were the model couple, and anybody from outside looking in would have thought everything was hunky-dory. Were there other people in Bill's life that maybe had a clue? How would that have shown up for them?
You know, it's interesting because after his suicide, a lot of his clients and friends, thinking back, they'd say, you know, I did notice he wasn't himself, or he was very quiet and he wasn't sharing and laughing and he wasn't himself. But I will say that a lot of people, including my husband, Bill, when they have to, they can be the great pretender.
Right.
They can put on that smiling face and do what they have to do, and then come back to their safe place at home and crawl back into bed and sink back into their depression. So I will say that there were subtle signs that people spoke about after his death, but there were no blaring warning signs that anybody noticed.
Well, yeah, because he had this great disguise on, right? I mean, I would not think of a bodybuilder, someone who's taking care of themselves physically, would be mentally depressed or would be feeling less about themselves when they have this wonderful physique and they're teaching people how to have the same thing. That doesn't fit into the mold of someone who's depressed, right? I imagine depressed people would be on the couch, eating potato chips and watching TV, right? So it wouldn't have been
the bill I saw.
Clue.
Right, that's the bill I saw. The bill that came home and immediately went to bed and didn't talk and was channel surfing with the remote and just basically numb. But the interesting thing is, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think most people think that there is a stereotype of someone who's depressed. And my message is that depression and mental illness does not discriminate. It can and does happen to all, anyone. So there is not a profile, and we shouldn't just think, and people would say to me, what did he have to be depressed about? You guys had a beautiful home overlooking the harbor. You had a successful business. You walked to work. You had a vacation home in Mexico. What did Bill possibly have to be depressed about?
Yeah.
That's why it's so important for people to understand it's not a choice. It's an illness, and it needs to be treated as such.
So what I'm really hearing is, and I myself have experienced 2 close friends that have committed suicide, and I was totally blindsided. I had no idea. And what I'm hearing from you is that a lot of people that are close, they might have some kind of indication, but it's not a given thing. You can't point a finger at somebody and say, oh, we got to watch you. Although I'm sure there are cases like that. So then to me, this becomes, and I think this is your message, Christy, is an awareness thing. And an awareness, and we're talking about teenagers here. And so what is your message to a teenager let's say is in that crisis, right? They're not thinking clearly, they're not making good decisions, and they're about to end it.
Well, my message is that, like I said, depression and mental illness isn't a choice.
Right.
So if our teens can understand, I'm not choosing this, and if my parents or other adults are saying, hey, come on, I had it worse when you were a kid, or snap out of it, you've got a pretty good life. It's an illness. And it's so important for teens to know that, so they will feel secure and comfortable and empowered to reach out and ask for help and tell an adult that they trust. So it's important for teachers and parents and adults in their life to not minimize how they're feeling. And not say things like, oh, well, when I was a kid, I had it much worse than you, or you have everything. What could possibly be the problem? Because then you are minimizing their illness. And you wouldn't say that if they had cancer.
Right.
You wouldn't say, well, get out of bed, you're fine. You would take them to a professional and start treatment. So that's why it's important for us as adults to open that line of communication so our youth will tell us and reach out to us when they need help.
So how can you distinguish between actual depression and a teenager who's just being moody? A teenager who just, has had a bad day, or maybe doesn't feel liked at school. Is that all the same thing, or are there differences there?
No, there are blatant differences. I mean, we all feel sad and bad and get down.
Depressed. I mean, we all get...
If you call that depression from time to time. What distinguishes major depressive disorder is when it doesn't lift. So you feel sad and dark and lonely and hopeless even when everything is going right. So, and this goes on for several weeks, and that dark cloud is following you everywhere. So that's a big difference between just normal, teenage sadness.
Okay. And perhaps even if they don't take delight in things that they used to enjoy, is that something else that we should be watching out for?
That's a huge warning sign, is when they don't have any interest in activities that they once enjoyed. Let's say they were in sports or in drama or in extracurricular activities, and then suddenly they don't want to do that anymore. But that has always been a life passion of theirs. So the disinterest in things they used to be interested is a big warning sign. Change of friends. So let's say, your child used to hang out with a certain group of kids that got good grades and were involved in school activities and community, and now suddenly they have a whole different set of friends. The withdrawal, the hopelessness, the change in eating or sleeping patterns, the lack of taking care of themselves, personal hygiene. They don't even care if they take a shower or wash their hair, or they don't care about their clothes. So all of those are warning signs that there is a serious problem and they need help.
Now, your book is so good, Christy, because it does talk directly to the teenager and others who are feeling this hopelessness.
With stories. I mean,
Yeah.
you have lots of,
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask, if you could share with us. I believe Gavin is one of the first characters that you introduced, but there might be some others that you would like to talk about instead. But share with us a story about someone you know personally besides your husband that you've highlighted in the book, just to give our listeners an idea of what happens in the mind of someone who's going through this.
Well, Gavin, you're right, is the first story in the book, because I wanted there to be stories of real teens all over the country that are experiencing all these different issues that I talk about in the book. So Gavin is a son of a good friend of mine, and he lives locally, and he agreed to share his story, and he fits that profile of exactly what we were talking about. He seemed fine on the outside, this tall, handsome, popular kid, and he seemed to have everything going for him. And out of nowhere and impulsively, he decided that he didn't want to be here anymore. He was experiencing a lot of darkness. And a few miles up the road, he was at a shopping center, and he went to the top of the parking lot, and he was about to jump. And then for some reason, he just took that split second to kind of pause, and he looked up and he saw the sign of the hospital across the street. And he decided that instead of jumping, he was going to go over to that hospital and get help. So he started out as somebody that doesn't seem to have all those warning signs and risk factors of depression. And then it turned into a message of hope. But what's really, really important is that we understand that teenage brain. Yeah. Because that prefrontal cortex, that front part of your brain, is the last to develop in teens. And it usually doesn't happen until about age 25. And that is the part of the brain that controls impulse, and it's important for decision making. And that's why I'm so passionate about educating and creating awareness for teens. They're more apt to act impulsively. Right. So Gavin was a teenager, and the fact that he stopped for that second and reconsidered his actions, that's kind of rare.
Yeah.
As you think back to when you were a teen, and I'm speaking for myself, I can't believe some of the choices I made. But I would make that choice first, and then later I would think, what was I thinking?
Yeah. I still think that.
I do too, but it's not as often.
Right.
So once your brain is fully developed, let's say, age 21 to 25, somewhere in that range, that front part of your brain is making you stop and pause and think about the consequences, right? Like, oh, you know what? Maybe this isn't a good idea. Maybe I'm going to be hurting people. Maybe I'm going to be destroying other people's lives. Maybe there is help. Maybe I have a purpose in life. So that's a really important thing for all of us to realize, and for parents and teachers, because sometimes we as adults we need to act as their prefrontal cortex and make those decisions for them, right?
Right.
Don't tell them that though, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's important for them to know there's a reason for your reckless behavior. And
Right.
sometimes, and it is because of your brain development. And so don't think your parents are just trying to be bossy. Their brains are fully developed, and sometimes they will make a better choice for you than you're capable of making yourself.
And in fact, I think you say in your book that when we become parents, there is something released in our brain that gives us the focus of keep this kid alive, and so parents lay down rules and they lay down boundaries for our children to keep them safe and to keep them alive. And sometimes that's hard for kids. They always want to butt up against that as far as they can go, right?
Oh, of course. And you know what? We do have that instinct to protect our youth, but that's not always the case. Because, as you said earlier, I also work with addicts in recovery. And a lot of those kids grew up in a home where their parents were either addicts themselves or they didn't have that love and that nurturing.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not always the case that these kids are growing up with loving parents.
Yeah.
Well, and I have to think, so we have, this whole social media change. Our society is just being radically changed, and it's quick. I mean, it blows my mind to think what was 10, 12 years ago and what we have today. It's like, that's just fast. And I don't think that our brains can even comprehend, the social impact and what's going on. I think they're learning a lot of things. But how much does that, I mean, we've talked a little bit about that, but then there's this whole issue of drugs and alcohol, Christy, and that can take a kid and even an adult to a dark, deep place.
Well, and that's another issue. I have a whole chapter on substance abuse in my book, because what happens is when our youth are struggling just with life and getting through their day at school, they are looking for relief. They are looking for somewhere to turn that is not quite so painful. So that creates a whole array of issues. And, if you think about it, when you're depressed or you're being bullied, of course, it seems natural that you might turn to drugs or alcohol in search for some relief. So when they have these difficult lives, that's when these other issues are more apt to happen. The drugs, the alcohol, the self-harm, the eating disorders, they're all symptomatic of the struggles that these kids are going through. And that's why we need to get to the bottom of what is causing that.
Do you think that there might be a point in our future where social media is not going to be available for kids up to a certain age? And do you think that would be a good idea?
I think that would be a great idea. I think it's really difficult to get parents and teachers and adults on the same page to monitor the usage of their children's social media so their kid is not the one left out. That doesn't help with depression. That doesn't help those kids that are already struggling with depression. So that's a really difficult task, to have everybody say, okay, after 6 o'clock, everybody in our school district, all of our children's social media is going to be shut down at 6 p.m. I mean, that would be wonderful. So I don't know what the answer is, but I also know that we as adults are just as guilty. I mean, I will walk into Starbucks and I will see 40 adults on their phones. Nobody's looking up, right?
Right.
So we also need to curb that, because our youth are watching us. And for a lot of us, and I'll include myself, we're not always setting the best examples.
Right.
Leadership by example, right, Jackie?
Well, that's right. And they say comparison is the thief of joy. Right? So social media has opened up the opportunity for us to compare ourselves to other people. You don't usually post your bad days on social media. It's always, hey, I just did this or that. And we begin to think everybody's having a better life than we are. And especially if your brain is not fully formed and you don't know how to interpret those things, that can really lead to problems, right?
And what's interesting on my social media, on my Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, when I post something very real, like I'm having a really hard day today. I am laying here in bed and I am talking myself into getting out of bed and starting my day because I had triggers this morning. I heard train whistles and it was a trigger and I feel sad and I am having to do some real positive self-talk. Those are the posts that get so much interaction because people can relate to that and I'm being very real. And it's interesting that gets the most interaction on my social media when I'm very real.
Yeah.
So what if we trained our kids then to do that?
Right. Well,
Train those teens to say, hey, I'm not having a good day. I'm feeling bad about myself. I'm thinking about not being here anymore or something like that. If maybe they're willing to share things like that, they might get those responses that they need. Right?
And I think they'd be surprised at the number of their peers that actually reach out and are there for them and they have no idea.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that would be in an ideal world if all of us could be a little more real on social media. We would all be a little more relatable.
Right.
But
yeah.
they're less likely to do that, I don't think. And maybe that's part of the awareness piece, right? Christy is getting them to realize to reach out and to share our inner thoughts and feelings. It just seems like a really, really fuzzy line to get teens to be able to do that.
It's a fuzzy line to get adults to do that, right?
Well, that's true.
Right. We only post that usually the really positive things that are going on in our life. And, you know, there should be some balance in there somewhere. But for kids, they don't want to admit that they are struggling because they are just starting to develop some self-confidence. They don't quite know who they are yet. So they're struggling with their own self-esteem and they don't have the self-confidence to really put themselves out there in a negative light.
Right. We talked a little bit about it, Christy, but maybe we could dig down into it just a little bit more. And that's give us some of the warning signs. I think you talked about, you know, not wanting to get up and go to school, but there's other things like diet and exercise and caring about things, and maybe give us kind of that rundown.
Well, what you can do when you're feeling dark or depressed is you've got to make yourself do things that you don't want to do. And I mean, just take baby steps.
Right.
Get outside, get some sunlight, get some vitamin D, get some exercise, eat healthy. And, you know, those might all seem really obvious, but if you understand that by exercising, which is so important, and eating healthy and taking care of yourself, it actually is altering your brain chemistry.
Well, and diet too, right? The intake of proper food and vitamins.
That vitamin D and getting out in nature. So when your dopamine level in your brain is increased, you will start to feel better about yourself and your life. So you have to take small steps and start by moving. I think that's probably one of the most important things. And also getting adequate sleep, because we all know when you have sleepless nights, the next day, your decision-making ability is really, really poor. You're a lot more likely to get in an accident. You're a lot more emotional. So all of these things and these tools, the eating healthy, the sleep, the vitamin D, getting out in nature, exercising, actually is rewiring your brain and raising the dopamine, that feel-good chemical in your brain chemistry.
I was hugely awakened when I discovered about hydration. And that's a big one too, because now I can tell when I'm not hydrated enough because my thought processes are just, it's just,
foggy.
Yeah. And it's like, well, what's going on? Oh, I haven't drank any water. It doesn't happen anymore because I'm so aware of keeping myself hydrated. But, you know, that's got to be huge in teens. I know for my kids, soda pop or anything other than water was on their radar.
Yes, and the sugar in the sodas, and you're right, they don't drink water. So that is a really important thing, because a lot of times when you're dehydrated, you eat because you think that you're hungry when in fact you're just dehydrated. Also, when your blood sugar drops, right, you have the brain fog.
Totally.
You can't make good decisions, and a lot of our youth will go most of the day without eating. So that's also something that should be on their list of things to make them feel better.
Right.
Well, let's approach this from the other side then, because I'm a parent of 3 lovely daughters, and I'm trying to relate and understand. But as a parent, and if we suspect something, Christy, like any teenager, I mean, if you came directly at them with something and you were concerned, they're just going to flip out. It could even make it worse, right? So how, as a parent, do we approach a concern or an instance, say?
Well, I think the most important thing to do is to find a time when you have their undivided attention. Don't try to start up a conversation when they're on their phone with their friends. So what I mean by that would be maybe they're in the car and you have a 20-minute drive to get home, or they're in bed and you're sitting at the end of their bed and you have their undivided attention. They're actually held hostage. So that's
step one, take your child hostage.
So get the keys, right, Jackie?
So
give me your keys, give me your phone.
It's important to choose the time wisely. When you start that conversation, don't start it with something that's judgmental. Don't say, what's wrong with you, right? You need to say, hey, Julie, I've noticed that you've been really quiet lately, and I'm concerned. As your dad, I love you so much, and is everything okay? Or, maybe if you don't want to make it about them, you say, your friend Karen was over here and she didn't seem herself. Is there something going on with her?
Right.
And also,
that's a good point, because we're on this is now becoming on our radar, and our kids' friends. I mean, we could be that bridge there too. Wow.
Yeah. And so you may be able to open that conversation using their friends as that little bit of information that gets them to open up. And you may get, I'm fine. Or, is everything okay? Yes.
How about my favorite, whatever?
Yes. Or you might get kind of blown off by your child, but then realize this. Just because it's a convenient time for you to have that conversation with them, it may not be exactly that time when they want to have it with you. So the best way to handle that is say, all right, Julie, I just want you to know that I'm here for you. And I want to keep the lines of communication open with you. So whenever you're ready and you want to talk, I'm here for you, because I have your best interest at heart, because I love you and I'm your dad. And so then maybe 3 days from then, they'll come up and say, hey, you know what, Dad, remember that night when you sat at the end of my bed and I kind of just blew you off? Well, you were right. I am really struggling, and here's what I'm struggling with. So don't give up, right? Just keep those lines of communication open so that they feel comfortable coming to you when they're ready.
Right. I think you mentioned not be judgmental, to don't be judgmental. I think that's huge with parents. I think we tend to have these expectations that our children will be this or that, or they'll do this or that. And it's easy to fall into a judgmental thinking process about them. But I think in these cases especially, we need to be very open to allowing them to say what they need to say without that judgment, right? Because if they start to feel that we're judging them, that just adds to the problem if they're already depressed, right? Because they know they're not only letting themselves down, but now they're letting us down, and that can be just as much of a problem as themselves, right?
And when you minimize the way they're feeling, you are making it worse, because now you've added that element of, not only am I in a dark place, but now I'm letting my parents down. So that actually makes it worse. So you have to be careful not to say things like, what's wrong? You know, or your sisters.
You're acting weird. Why are you
Yes.
doing that? Why
What's
are
wrong with you? And your sisters aren't acting like this.
Oh, right.
And you have the same parents and family environment. So what's wrong with you? They're immediately going to shut down and feel like they've disappointed you. And that's the last thing that you want to happen.
So is there a time then when we could tell that our children are ready to get additional help? I mean, will they say that, or is there some signs that we can look for that helps us know maybe this is the time to offer that they go see somebody or talk to somebody or something like that?
Well, when these warning signs and risk factors keep getting bigger and there's more of them and they don't ever seem to lift and your child's behavior isn't changing, as a matter of fact, it's getting worse, that's when you need to step up and get them professional help. So, you know, if their grades keep getting worse and they're skipping school and, or, you know, the signs of bullying, if they have unexplained bruises or injuries, or their backpack and their iPad are missing and there's no explanation, you have to kind of have eagle eyes for all of these things. Yeah. And if this continues to go on and your child continues to stay shut down, you need to get them help.
So should you take them hostage again, so to speak, and actually get them to a professional? I mean, because even if they're reluctant to do that, or, you know.
Well, it's all in how you handle that conversation. And, you know, if there wasn't stigma, of course they'd get in the car and go to a mental health professional because they aren't feeling mentally healthy. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's so important for you to work as well in abolishing that stigma so that your kids don't feel like there's something wrong with getting help from a mental health professional. So, you know, if they broke their arm, they jump in the car to get help. And it shouldn't be any different with a mental health issue. And that's why we all need to be on the same page and stop minimizing people's behavior when they're in a depressed state.
And it sounds like we just need to reinforce that the child is not bad.
Or
the child
broken.
is not weird. Yeah, the child is not, but it's something is happening in their brain that needs a doctor to help set right. It's not something that they've done. It's just it's like being sick, right? In your body. You need certain medicine or something like that.
And if you were diagnosed with cancer, I don't think you'd have that overwhelming feeling of shame and guilt.
Right.
Would you? I mean, you don't feel guilty because you have cancer. So there shouldn't be shame and guilt and disappointment associated with a mental illness because it is no one's choice. It's an illness and they need treatment.
Right. So what is your purpose or your goal with sharing your story in so many different books and in this latest book? What do you hope will be accomplished by letting yourself out there?
My main mission is to abolish the stigma of mental illness so we can talk about it, have normal, open conversations about our mental health. So without the stigma, we are going to reach out and get the help that we need. When we get help, we are going to help eliminate the epidemic of especially teen suicides. So it's a multifaceted mission of mine, but it needs to start with creating awareness because that will help abolish the stigma. When the stigma is abolished, we will all reach out and get help. And when we get help, the number of suicides will decrease.
Okay, great. Now your book, the foundation of your book is really about hope. So how have you, I know it was your husband made the choices he did because he lacked hope, and anyone who's committed suicide lacks hope. I mean, I think you would agree with that, right?
Yes.
So how in this turmoil of what's happened in your life with your husband and others that you've known, how have you maintained hope as being a caregiver or someone looking from the outside in? How has that affected you?
Well, I think it starts with education, and it started with me educating myself. I mean, I did a lot of research on depression and mental illness and suicide. And when I finally realized, you know what? Depression and mental illnesses are diseases. And when you understand that it's a disease and there's help, that is what brings the hope, right? So first and foremost, we have to understand and accept mental illness and depression as a disease. And that's part of the education. And it would be like, if you have a physical illness and then you are going through treatment and then you start to develop hope that you are no longer going to be physically sick, right? So if we do that with our mental health and treat it as a disease, and that is what is going to inspire hope.
Well, so as you are the grief girl, which is kind of a sad name. I mean, I understand it, but
you know what? You remember it.
I do remember it. I want to say, good grief, girl.
Good grief, girl. At least you put good in front.
That's right.
That's right.
So how do you help people get through the process then when there has been a loved one in their life that has made this choice and will not be coming home? How do you help them work through that grief process?
Well, my first step is education. And I go back to where I was at the point of directly after Bill's suicide. And my first emotions and my first feelings were guilt, shame, what if, what could I have done differently? I owned all of it. I basically thought it was my fault. I felt some shame. I felt all of these different emotions. So the first thing that I work with when someone's lost a loved one to suicide is, you had nothing to do with this. Get rid of that guilt, get rid of that shame, get rid of what did I do wrong, what didn't I do, and stop owning that it's your fault. Because I think a lot of times when there's death, sometimes I think there's no such thing as death without guilt, right? And that is usually one of the first places a survivor of suicide goes, is what could I have done differently? So once I work with people on not owning that they had anything to do with it and make them understand that it was a disease and it does not discriminate, it had nothing to do with them, that usually gets them on the path to healing.
Oh my goodness, ladies. We are out of time. Can you believe it?
What?
Wow.
I know.
I'm getting warmed up.
I'm definitely going to have you come back, because I think there's a lot more to this discussion, and there's going to be a lot more awareness that comes out after. And I think you have another book cooking in you, don't you?
I have a couple.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
Good.
Thank you so much for showing up as you today and for your great message. I think you just keep going, girl, and don't stop, because I don't want to step on you.
Well, thank you for that belief in me, and thank you guys so much for having me on today.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I had a
It was
lot.
our pleasure, for sure.
That's about all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed today's show. You can always tell a friend about this show and then sign up for the newsletter. Go to www.lifemasteryradio.net. Sign up for the newsletter. You can find Christy's link to her website. Her book is on Amazon. And it was a really, really, really great show. Lastly, I would really like for you to make it a great day, because it's all about choice, and you can choose to make it groovy too. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Christy. Bye-bye.
Thank you.